In this video, we will be talking about the different triangles of the neck. We have two big triangles and six smaller triangles. Now, we will first be talking about the two big triangles. This is the lateral side of the neck, and we have different landmarks. Superiorly, we have the mandible. Anteriorly, we have the midline of the neck. Inferiorly, we have the clavicle, and posteriorly, we have the trapezius muscle. So as you can see, these landmarks form what we call a square. And to form two triangles, we need to divide the square into two. And the muscle that divides this square to form two triangles is what we call the sternocleidomastoid. It is called as such because of its attachments, which are the following: the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process. Now, the first triangle is what we call the anterior triangle. It is bounded superiorly by the mandible, anteriorly by the midline of the neck, and posteriorly by the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. And the second triangle is what we call the posterior triangle, and it is bounded anteriorly by the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, inferiorly by the clavicle, and posteriorly by the trapezius muscle. To summarize this concept using a diagram, suppose this is a square and superiorly the mandible, midline of the neck, clavicle, and trapezius, and this is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. This part is what we call the anterior triangle, and this part is what we call the posterior triangle. Now, the second part of the video is all about the six smaller triangles within these triangles. So this is the mandible, midline of the neck, clavicle, and trapezius muscle. This is again the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So let's put up another landmark, which is what we call the hyoid bone, the bone of the tongue, and this is what we call the mentum. And we have another muscle, and this muscle is called the digastric muscle. We have, as you can see, we have two bellies. This is what we call the digastric muscle, the anterior belly and the posterior belly. And another muscle is called the omohyoid muscle. It is divided into two by the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is the superior and the inferior part of the omohyoid muscle. Now, this part, this is the first triangle, the first small triangle. This is what we call the digastric triangle. And superiorly, it is bounded by the mandible, anteriorly by the anterior belly of the digastric muscle, and posteriorly by the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. The next triangle is what we call the submental triangle. Suppose this is a triangle and its apex is formed by the mentum and its base is formed by the hyoid bone. Its two sides are formed by the anterior bellies of the digastric muscle. Now, let's proceed to the third small triangle, which is what we call the carotid triangle. It is bounded superiorly by the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, antero-inferiorly by the superior omohyoid muscle, and posteriorly by the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. Now, the fourth triangle is what we call the muscular triangle. It is bounded superiorly by the superior omohyoid muscle, posteriorly by the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, and anteriorly by the midline of the neck. The fifth smaller triangle is the occipital triangle. So, it is bounded posteriorly by the anterior border of the trapezius, anteriorly by the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, and inferiorly by the inferior omohyoid muscle. Now, the sixth triangle is what we call the subclavian triangle or the supraclavicular triangle, supra because it's above the clavicle. Posteriorly, it's bounded by the inferior omohyoid muscle, inferiorly by the clavicle, and anteriorly by the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Now let's summarize it using a diagram. Suppose this is a square, the lateral side of the neck, superiorly the mandible, anteriorly the midline of the neck, and then inferiorly the clavicle, posteriorly the trapezius. Then let's divide it into two triangles using the sternocleidomastoid muscle, that's the anterior and the posterior triangle. We need to put landmarks. Let's put the hyoid bone, and let's put the digastric muscle and the omohyoid muscle. Now, the digastric muscle is separated into two, anterior and the posterior belly, and the omohyoid muscle, superior and inferior omohyoid muscle. Now, the first triangle is what we call the digastric triangle or submandibular triangle. The second triangle is what we call the submental triangle. The third triangle is what we call the carotid triangle. The fourth triangle is what we call the muscular triangle. The fifth triangle is what we call the occipital triangle. And lastly, the sixth triangle is what we call the subclavian triangle or the supraclavicular triangle. Now, if you memorize this diagram, you don't need to really memorize the borders because it's included in the picture already. For example, the digastric triangle. The borders are the mandible and the digastric bellies. For the submental triangle, the borders are the sides, which are the anterior bellies and the hyoid bone. For the carotid triangle, the borders are the following: the omohyoid muscle, the digastric belly, the posterior one, and the sternocleidomastoid, the anterior border. The muscular triangle, the midline of the neck, the omohyoid muscle, and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And then for the occipital, the borders are the following: trapezius, sternocleidomastoid muscle, and the omohyoid muscle. For the supraclavicular triangle, the omohyoid muscle, the sternocleidomastoid, and also the clavicle. Now, let's have a short exam and you can answer this silently, and let's proceed.